In today's class, we are finishing chapter 3 on human variation. In the last class, I said that what we wanted to focus on in this chapter is the paradox that in some ways we humans are so genetically similar, so alike each other, so interbreeding, so gene sharing, and yet we look a lot different from each other, or at least we think we do. If you look at penguins, for example, penguins are actually a lot more genetically diverse than humans are, but it's hard to tell. Whereas we seem to think that we're quite different from each other. Now, might just be because we're used to looking for certain things. Maybe if we were penguins, we'd think each penguin was different, but we can't tell because we're not penguins. But it does seem that humans are quite biologically varied, but how does that happen? Our textbook, like I said, kind of hid the answer in a caption: relatively recent evolutionary adaptations to new and localized environmental challenges have altered our visible phenotypes. So this is, as we talked about, we're genetically very similar, but some recent stuff has altered what we see visibly and also perhaps some of our invisible traits, which we'll talk about. In this part, they go into more detail about how these changes have occurred and why. So they begin with this section on human variation and genetic adaptation. And just want to stress here that when we're talking about relatively recent, a lot of these regional geographic variations have come about in the last 50,000 years or so. And we know this because that's when humans began to be in different parts of the world. Before that, humans were mostly in Africa and thereabouts, but they started to move into more extreme climate regions at about 50,000 years ago, down to about maybe 15,000 years ago. So some of these things are really quite recent, in the thousands of years ago, and some of them might be a little deeper. But in evolutionary time, as we talked about, this is nothing. This is a very short amount of time, evolutionarily speaking. It's not enough time to do a serious genetic modification, certainly not enough time to do any kind of speciation or anything like that. So we might have subgroups of humans or different populations, but there's been no time to do anything like we might consider speciation events, either in the past 50,000, 200,000 years, and certainly not anything coming up. The other thing we want to stress about all of these variations is that for the most part, they are clinal. Well, that's a technical term, which basically means continual across a range, or they happen gradually. And so if you're taking a walk between different populations, you'll see a gradual shift in blood types and skin tones. And well, I should say a gradual shift in percentage of blood types, gradual shift in skin tones, gradual shift in things like body shape. And so these things there aren't hard and fast lines between groups. The other thing we know from our Punnett squares and Mendelian combinations is that these traits can combine and recombine independently. So whether you are of a certain skin color doesn't determine whether you will be lactose tolerant. And whether you are a certain body shape doesn't necessarily determine what kind of malaria resistance you'll have. And so these things can come up in different ways. They don't all come as one group of things. Now, I want to pause here for a second and talk to us about why this chapter happens now. That is to say, we're here and we're talking about things that have happened in the last 50,000 years. In the next chapter, we're going to be talking about primates. We're going to go back, I don't know, 10 million years or so. And then we'll be talking about the development of early hominins and humans. We'll be going back like 8 million years or 6 million years ago. My question to you is this: why do we want to start talking about human variation now, this recent stuff, before we go back 6 or 8 million years into the past? Why do we want to clear this up in our heads before we start talking about bipedal as tool use and humans spreading out all over the world? Yeah, maybe this is a good entry point because we can see each other around us and we want to know. I'll just say that this chapter, the reason it's here has to do a lot with what we don't see in human variation, what we do not see. Now, that is to say, what we do not see is deep evolutionary genetic human differences. Because we believe, or many of us are taught to believe, that the differences we see around us are deep and genetic, and that they can be grouped according to something that we call race. We group people into races and we have them check off boxes and we say what race we are. And we believe that's what we see when we look at people. And so if I were simply to rewind 8 million years ago and not tell you about this before, we would all be thinking, I wonder if that's how we got race. I wonder if that's how we got race. I wonder how deep far it back. There it is. There's those monkeys. There's those primates. There's those bipedal, and now they're spreading out, and that's how we got races. That isn't how we got races. That has nothing to do with race. All the stuff we're going to do up till about 50,000 years ago has nothing to do with how we got ideas about human biological difference today. So the reason we're doing this chapter now is just to get it out of your heads that when we go back in time, that somehow we're going to discover these deep genetic human differences. What we don't see as we look at our traits, and this again is it goes with the last one, we don't see is human groups divided up into these rigid bounded categories. We see gradual variation, constant gene flow across the range. We see this throughout human history from our African origins through our spread all over the world. And of course, definitely in the present, we do not see these kinds of rigid boundaries. And we do not see traits coming as packages. So we can say, like I just said, that if you have this, then you're definitely going to have that. Certainly, there are geographic, what we might call clumps of traits. People with brown hair and brown eyes tend to concentrate and get together over time. But if you go out and get together with somebody else who has different traits, which people are always doing, then it all gets resorted and repackaged again. So it's very important that we did this chapter when we talked about the present before we go back into human evolution. Because like I said, most of the differences that we categorize ourselves in today's world have emerged quite recently. They were not deep in our evolutionary history. In fact, we will learn that the groups in the olden days were much more diverse genetically. There were many more species of hominins than there are today. We are a much less diverse group than we used to be in the past, at least genetically speaking. Okay, so I have shorter limbs, so I'm conserving my heat. Yeah, look at those Inuit there, conserving their heat by having shorter limbs. And there's some Maasai with some long limbs, so they don't want to conserve their heat. Bergman's rule, what's that? Yeah, it kind of sounds, yeah. So we have a couple people who made up these rules that are generally true as people go into these more extreme environments. People tend to maybe get lankier or more compact. But as you keep reading along, there's kind of this, oh shit moment that you get to. It seems not real. And certainly it's real, but it's like not the full explanation of things. So if you keep reading in this, you had Allen and Bergman, and they came up with these rules, and they're generally true, but I'd consider them more like guidelines. They're certainly not laws. They're more like guiding principles for how our bodies might evolve if we're staying outside all the time and need to either conserve heat or get rid of heat. But as they say here, the adjustment to living in cold climates has come only relatively recently in our history. And the distinction between differently adapted body types doesn't break into just two categories. So it's not that there's Allen over here and Bergman over here, and we can sort the world into these two categories. That's why I call it the oh shit moment, because there's a spectrum of average body shapes seen among humans today that reflect many adaptations to specific regional climates. So on the one hand, we have these kind of general guidelines about heat and cold, but on the other hand, people live in these seasonal variable climates. They mix with each other, and there's always going to be variation within a specific community as well as between communities. And so the rules in this case are not as prevalent as you might expect. Yeah, they call it skin reflectance. It's just another way of measuring skin color. And as you can see here, we probably all at one point, all human beings probably evolved to have darker skin tones. And then as people moved into different climates, some people mutated out and got different adaptations and became lighter skinned people. And again, this is along a gradient or a clinal variation. So if you walk from the north to the south, you're going to see a gradual change in populations in both continents. Or if you go from east to west or north to south, even in a place like India, you see a gradual change along this line. And there's no place that you cross a river or something and you say, I'm in the land of the high reflectant people now. So we have low reflectance and high reflectance and a whole bunch of ranges in between. And if you line all the people up, they're going to have all the reflectances. There's not just 2 or 3 groups of people. This is a range of people. What's the pattern here? Why would you want to have light skin if you are in the northern or the southern poles? Oh, wait a second. You don't want to have light skin, but there may be a little bit of an advantage if you happen to live in these areas in the very olden days. Yeah, to get vitamin D. So vitamin D absorption seems to be the explanation for why this may have been an adaptive trait as people moved into more extreme places without the sunlight. And of course, if you are nearer to the equator, why might you want to have darker skin? Maybe this is easier than vitamin D. Yeah, protection from UV. So it offers some natural protection from UV. Again, there's a range of variance here. There's range of reflectance. I would also say that I put in an answer which some of you chose about founder effect, which would be the idea that because people of different skin color didn't like each other, then they moved away from each other. Nah, that's not the way it works. People just moved and then later the skin color started to shift. But this is what basically explains our levels of melanin found in the outer layer of our skin. And again, this graph would be populations in, say, 1,500 or indigenous populations to this area. Now that people move all around in different ways, this doesn't apply to the same extent, but this would be with populations that had thousands of years in this region. Sickle cell trait, which is actually often referred to, especially in places where you don't want it, as sickle cell disease or sickle cell anemia, is something that arose because of natural selection. It arises around areas where malaria is present. If you're heterozygous for sickle cell trait, that is to say you have one dominant and one recessive, it conveys malarial resistance. So if you live in an area where it is adaptive, if there is malaria, it is an adaptive trait because you're resistant to malaria if you're heterozygous. But it's a hugely maladaptive and very painful and potentially life-threatening trait if you are homozygous, if you have the 2 recessives of sickle cell. And so it's actually it is natural selection, but it's just a cruel example of natural selection because it's an example of how something can be adaptive in a certain environment, but it's also very maladaptive if that environment changes. So people who are not living in a malaria area anymore are going to be still susceptible to this disease but they're not getting any benefit for it. And so for me, it's an example of how survival of the fittest is actually not how we should describe evolution. Because yeah, if you're in a malaria environment, you are one of the fittest. But if the environment changes, then that is not a good thing to have. And so whenever we talk about fitness, we have to talk about the environment. There's no absolute measure of fitness. It is always done in a changing environmental time. Now, in our own country, we sometimes get confused about sickle cell trait. As they say here, sickle cell arises where malaria, it's basically where malaria arises, and it maps onto, here they have certain parts of Africa, but it's also pretty prevalent in parts of, or it was pretty prevalent in parts of Greece and Cyprus and Crete up here, and parts of Saudi Arabia. So the reason we get sometimes in the United States, people get confused is because of the enslavement of Africans from this part of Africa. People in the United States sometimes link sickle cell to say, oh, it's a race trait or it's a racial trait. It is actually not. Like I said, it has a high prevalence in people from Greece and Saudi Arabia because of slavery, basically, and because where people were dragged from their homelands to the United States, that becomes linked in our own minds to race. But it is actually not a racial trait. It actually also occurs with a pretty high frequency in India. They don't show you this map, but I kind of wish they would have, because India may have the second highest in the world load of sickle cell disease or sickle cell trait, again, because of its association with malaria there. But it's another indication this is not a trait that is based on race.